Let us come before the Lord in prayer. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Come into the light. Come into the light. Those words ought to sound positive and inviting, affirming and beneficent. Light is warm and good and safe, after all. You often hear of people who are afraid of the dark. You rarely hear of people who are afraid of the light. And yet there's a part of me when I hear those words, come into the light, that recoils just a little bit. I immediately have flashbacks to my childhood and all of those movies I watched, movies like Mrs. Brisby and the Rats of Nim, Cinderella, The Little Mermaid. I remember scene after scene where the title character, so small and innocent and vulnerable, is called out into the light before one much more powerful than she. I remember Ms. Briz, as the crow called her, the shy little mother mouse quivering before the great owl, Nicodemus. I remember Cinderella standing alone in the open of a well-lit room before a stepmother who is watching her and speaking to her from the depths of the shadows. And I recall poor little Ariel facing up to the wrath of her father, King Triton, in the midst of the great throne room. Actually, I imagine that if you went back and reviewed all of those children's movies I used to watch, I would find in nearly all of them a scene where the main character is called out on the carpet, so to speak, and forced to stand alone under the glare of the lights where everyone can see her, but she can barely see a thing. I call these instances spotlight moments, and I think we've all experienced them. They are moments when everyone else can see you clearly, but because all the light or all the eyes in the room are shining upon you, you can't see anything at all. As adults, we have learned to avoid these moments like the plague. But as children, we stumbled into them all of the time, which is why I think you find them so often in children's films. I'm speaking of those moments when you're just going along, minding your own business, not a care in the world, and suddenly you look up to find that everyone is staring right at you because of something you just did. Perhaps you can remember a time when you were happily engrossed in an art project, say a grand mural of permanent marker covering the better part of the newly painted dining room wall, for instance, and looked up in surprise to see your mother staring down at you in horror. Or maybe you can remember a moment when, as a child, you said something you didn't realize you weren't supposed to say, and the whole room that had been happily buzzing away around you went absolutely and horribly silent. These are not happy moments in one's childhood, and they are absolutely excruciating in adulthood. I speak from a vast wealth of experience. But they are learning moments, moments when the light of dawning recognition steals up upon us and whaps us none too gently upside the head. So when I think about coming into the light, there is a part of me that regards such an invitation with a great deal of trepidation. I know in the long run that such an occurrence is probably for the best, but I also know better than to think it's going to be an entirely comfortable experience. And I imagine I'm in good company. That is, I think both the Israelites of the Old Testament and the disciples of the New would agree with me. In our readings today, Moses climbs to the top of Mount Sinai, and Jesus takes his disciples up a mountain near Caesarea Philippi. And there on these mountains, the light shines so brightly that for all involved, from that moment on, things are never quite the same. Upon Mount Sinai, Moses receives the 10 Commandments, a new law for an ancient people. Up until now, the Israelites have been wandering, at times prospering, at others suffering. They have known what it is to wield power, and they have known what it is to be slaves, but they have not, up until now, known what it is to live according to the law. They have known that they are special, chosen of God to bless all humankind, but it is not until Moses ascends the mountain and disappears within the fiery cloud of God's glory that they fully understand what such blessing will entail. Out of light comes law, and out of law comes a great need for obedience and an even greater opportunity for sin. I had a professor back in divinity school who used to say, we talk about being chosen by God as if it's a good thing, a blessing of incalculable proportions, and on one very real level it is. But I am sure there were many days when the Israelites regarded their blessing as more of a curse. I have a feeling he was right. I mean, think about it. Once you know the rules, you know as well when you break them. Once you've been told no, you know the secret thrill of defiantly saying yes. The Israelites were given a gift, a framework upon which to build lives of holiness and blessing, integrity and grace, laws that, if kept to this day, still have the power to heal the rifts that spring up between brother and brother, nation and nation, humanity and God. But like us, they were only human, and people don't always embrace what is best for themselves. For the Israelites, their blessing was also a burden. The light of the law showed the way, but it also cast a long shadow, such that when they failed, when they stumbled, when they strayed into the darkness, they felt it acutely. Light brings awareness. It reveals beyond a shadow of a doubt the difference between good and evil, right and wrong. And yes, such clarity is a blessing, but that doesn't mean there aren't times when we long for the old days, when we didn't know any better. Just going to have to blow my nose, excuse me. All right. Light brings life, but it also brings a great degree of pressure to live a life worthy of such light. And I imagine, moving on now to our gospel reading, that no one felt that pressure more acutely than the 3 disciples who stood in the light of Jesus' transfiguration. Up until that point, I'm sure they felt some pressure. I mean, they were Jews after all, living under the law their ancestors had received from Moses. And if you're hanging out with Jesus day in and day out, well, that would simply up the ante. They may have been fishermen, a little salty, if you will, but I would think that around Jesus, they learned pretty quickly to watch their language. I bet they didn't pick on the sorts of people they used to pick on. Every day they were probably learning, bit by bit, what it was to be better, kinder, and more compassionate people. And I think it's important to remember that they were actually learning this in the strangest ways imaginable. Jesus was taking them amongst people they weren't allowed to mix with. Tax collectors and prostitutes, Samaritans and lepers. They were out partying with the compromised, mingling with the unclean, doing and saying things people back home would never believe. These young men, away from the watchful eyes of their families for the first time, were doing all the right sorts of things with all the wrong sorts of people. And yet, miraculously, they were learning to not just be good, but to love being good in the process. And I bet up until that moment on the mountaintop, it was all learned in good fun. I bet they were having the time of their lives. And then it happened. The glory of the Lord appeared, just as it had all those years ago on Mount Sinai. Jesus blazed before them in all his majesty. And all of a sudden, what had been a positive learning experience was transformed into the experience of a lifetime. Up until that moment, they knew Jesus was special. But to know and experience Jesus as God would have raised the stakes beyond anything they could have ever conceived of. All of a sudden, their dreams became terrifyingly real. In the light of his presence, they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was it. This was real. This was their moment. They were the ones they had been waiting for, and there would be no more excuses. There would be no turning back. In the light of Jesus' presence, they saw with painful clarity just how important their mission was and how ill-equipped they were to see that mission through. And yet in that moment, they could not deny their calling. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Coming into the light of God, into the light of true awareness, into the reality of God's great love for you is terrifying. Not just because you are in the presence of an awesome God, but because once you are in his presence, you can no longer deny who God really is in light of you and who you need to become in light of God. It is horrible because in that light you see clearly how imperfect, how inadequate, how insufficient you are. And yet it is also healing and wondrous and life-altering because no one has ever stood in that light and known anything but the purest love and the most boundless grace. Ultimately, God draws us into the light of his presence, not to overwhelm us with his glory, but to inspire us with his hope. We can do better. He knows it and believes it. He calls us into the light in the hopes that we might come to know and believe it too. I saw a wonderful movie this past week, Amazing Grace. Has anyone seen it? Anybody? I thought it was lovely. Do any of you know the story behind that hymn? Anybody? Oh, all right. It was written by John Newton, a slave trader who experienced a crisis of conscience spurred on by a crisis at sea. That is to say, one night during a horrible storm, he promised God that he would stop his work as a slaver if God would save his life. He already knew in his heart that his livelihood was abominable, but like many before and after, it took a near-death experience to bring him fully into the light. Newton's hymn, Amazing Grace, was written in response to his conversion, and his music and his preaching and his counsel in turn inspired William Wilberforce to take a seat within Parliament and use his power to lead the fight to abolish slavery in Great Britain. That fight is what the movie is all about. Well, Wilberforce spent the better part of his life assembling data and testimonies and petitions in an effort to garner the support of the general public and sway the members of Parliament to his side. At the very end of the movie, a quote appears on the screen, words I imagine that Wilberforce uttered at the conclusion of one of his great parliamentary speeches. It reads, "Having heard all this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." That's what I'm talking about. Once we enter into the light, we can no longer say, we did not know. Like Moses, like Jesus, Wilberforce brought a great darkness into the light and forced people to consider the consequences of their actions and actively change their ways. The light shows us the truth, undeniable, unequivocal, eternal. In the midst of such light, there is no room left for argument, no room left to sway. Once you stand in the light, there is no turning back. And this is why coming into the light is so hard. But come into the light we must. Yes, the glare may overwhelm us. The reality of our soul's state may depress us. The need to change will most certainly frighten us. But the good news, my friends, the good news is that the love and grace of God will be there to meet us, that we might march forward in the light of God, no longer blind, but willing and able to see.